what changed me, bit by bit. It was a gradual process. First, there was research about the effect of gun control laws on crime rates, and that basically indicated not much effect or no effect. That's what most of it did. It wasn't great research, but that's mostly what the early work said. But that really didn't bother pro-control people all that much, because their response was, well, that's just because the existing laws that we can test are too weak. It's a matter of dosage, not the medicine. If we only had stricter laws, then they'd show an impact. What was much more interesting to me as the research findings gradually came out was the work that kind of undercut what the rationale for gun control was, which was the notion that more guns lead to more violence. Otherwise, why would you want to restrict guns if there wasn't that fundamental effect? Ironically enough, though, probably the most interesting body of research, I was led to it by people who intended their writings to be pro-gun control. I read what was clearly a propaganda document produced by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which then and now is very pro-control. They probably even favor handgun bans. Okay. And it was about guns and self-defense. And it was intended to argue guns are useless for self-defense, they can be worse than useless, they can lead to either the offenders getting angrier and escalating their violence because the victim is resisting, or worse of all, the offender will snatch the gun away and use it against them. And they were arguing that defensive gun use by victims was ineffective, except being the methodological type I was, I looked closely at what the research actually said, and it was primitive research, but it really, to the extent it said anything on the topic at all, it indicated the opposite, that forceful resistance to crime was actually effective. They didn't specifically look at just gun resistance, but they had partially relevant research. It said forceful resistance of some kind, whether or not it involves guns, is effective. And it told me where this kind of data could be found. It was in something called the National Crime Victimization Survey. So then I got those data myself, and I started analyzing them for my own purposes, and that survey became increasingly sophisticated. It was a U.S. Bureau of the Census survey that asked people about crime victimization. Have you been a victim of crime in the last 6 months? If so, did you do anything to protect yourself during the incident? And what happened? Did you get injured? Did you lose property? So it had all the data I needed to do a much fancier analysis of this topic. Does armed self-defense work? And as the data got better and my analyses got more and more sophisticated, it increasingly indicated the opposite of what that original document had claimed. Defensive gun use, indeed most forms of self-protection by the victim, were effective. That is, they reduced the chances of being injured. They reduced the chances of property loss. In fact, it's a good thing to resist, which wasn't certainly the kind of advice you'd hear from police departments and victim advocates and other people posed as experts on the subject.
So how was it then, if you used the same data, or you took the data from the study and studied it yourself, how was it that they were able to take the same data and twist it to make it seem like resisting doesn't help?
It just goes to show, when you want a finding bad enough, you can interpret even contrary results as favoring your ideological position. It never should have happened. They shouldn't have misinterpreted the findings that badly. They could have reacted to the data by saying, well, the data aren't very good, and so we really can't draw any conclusions. But drawing the conclusion that it is good enough to say what the effects are, and the effects are bad or ineffective, that was wrong. It was just wrong.
Okay.
The other thing that they couldn't really get at very satisfactorily was how often this happened. Did lots of people use guns for self-protection, or is it something fairly rare? If it's really rare, who cares? You know, it's not very important a consideration. So let's say we're now up to maybe the early 90s. I got interested in the question of just how frequent or prevalent this behavior is, and the way you find out how prevalent a behavior is in the population is you do a survey, and you have to ask people. You're not going to find it in police data because it turns out virtually nobody who uses a gun for self-protection is foolish enough to report it to the police. In fact, it turns out they also don't report it to those interviewers in the National Crime Victimization Survey, the survey done by the Census Bureau. Unless you actively go out looking for it and ask a representative sample of the population if they've had that experience, you're not going to find it. And what I found is it's real common. In absolute terms, it's not common. That it's not a high percentage of the population. It's only around 1% of the population in any one year use a gun for self-protection as a crime victim.
By use gun, do you mean actually fire the weapon to protect themselves, or just pull, in some cases, pull the weapon to scare off?
The kind of cutoff for what they had to do at minimum was they at minimum had to threaten the offender. And that's all they do in most cases.
Okay.
They point the gun at them. They verbally refer to it and they say, "I've got a gun, so knock off what you're doing." They may fire a gun, but it's only a warning shot. Or sometimes they fire and they're trying to shoot the offender, and most of the time miss, but some of the time hit them. And we even got a few people reporting actually they thought they had actually wounded the offender, although often they really don't know. It's dark, the guy runs away, and who knows, they just like to think they hit him. But the vast majority of those defensive gun uses don't involve the gun even being fired, never mind wounding the offender. It's sufficient to threaten them. People do what you say when you threaten them with a deadly weapon.
And a high percentage of those homeowners or gun owners who threatened the attacker were able to properly defend themselves.
Almost all come out okay. Okay meaning they didn't get hurt, they didn't lose property. And nobody gets their gun taken away by the offender and have it used against them. That doesn't happen. And no, resisting does not make the offender angrier, so he escalates his violence and thereby increasing the chances of the victim being hurt. That doesn't happen either. Most forms of self-protection are effective, and resistance with a gun is even more effective than the other ones. That's the best way to summarize it. There aren't very many places that have gun bans in effect, and after the Heller decision, they're not going to have them very often, very, very long either. So the implication is you would be eliminating significant benefits of non-criminals having guns if you ban guns. So the implication is very hostile to banning guns. I never phrase it in terms of a recommendation, but it does kind of imply an endorsement of existing gun ownership and use for defensive reasons by saying, yeah, it's effective, it works.
So, as far as moderate controls then, would you be in support of the current status quo, which is banning guns on campuses? I know that in a lot of places there have been movements to try to allow students of age to have weapons on campus. Do you have a...
Yeah, age 21 and up, yeah.
Yes.
No, I don't support that, and it's basically because the ban is based on location and certain assumptions about those locations that are incorrect. You can see why people would be banned from carrying guns into prisons. It's filled with criminals, and you don't want the criminals to get a hold of the guns. On the other hand, it's not so obvious why you would have that same kind of ban in place on a college campus. College campuses are not full of criminals. In fact, despite these highly publicized instances of campus shootings, campuses are really, really safe. They're among the safest places in America, notwithstanding those isolated, highly publicized incidents. So there's no justification in terms of the risk of violence to ban anything related to guns on campuses in particular. You ought to ban anybody who's dangerous or likely to be dangerous from carrying a gun anywhere. So those are the folks who ought to be denied a carry permit for anywhere. But having a specialized ban applying to campuses doesn't make sense. And of course, occasionally there will be an instance in which people could use the gun defensively on campuses. It is a very safe place, but every once in a while there's a crime of a confrontational nature where the victim faces off against the offender and where a gun might be used defensively.
My final question here is on the age that people are allowed to own guns. I know that myself at 18, feeling as though 18 is the legal age for so many other things, I feel like, again, you're the expert here, that's why I'm asking you, but I feel like as an adult citizen on so many other things, I should be able to get a carry permit as well. So you would support lowering the age from 21 to 18?
To 18, and for pretty much the same reason. The rights of citizenship are the rights of citizenship, and I wouldn't make an exception for guns. The rationale you hear for why we should ban carrying by 18 to 20-year-olds is basically that the rate of violence is relatively high in that group. The problem with that reasoning is, although that's true as a fact, the other truth is that it's still only some tiny minuscule percentage of 18 to 20-year-olds. It's a higher minuscule fraction than in other age groups, but it's still minuscule, which means you're violating the principle that you ought to place restrictions only when they need to be placed. Well, you know, for 99% of the 18 to 20-year-olds, it was an unnecessary restriction. You were doing it just in the vain hopes of discouraging carrying by that tiny percentage of 18 to 20-year-olds.
And you would assume that, and this is true with every age group, but with that young age group, although it's slightly higher but still minuscule, that if someone wanted to commit violence anyway, they would, whether or not they had the opportunity to get a legal weapon.
Yeah, the legality of the carrying is hardly going to concern somebody who's already resolved to do a crime as serious as murder, never mind mass murder or even robbery. It's inconsistent with any criminological knowledge I'm aware of that people would refrain from, you know, be willing to commit murder but wouldn't be willing to violate the law against carrying a gun in a public place without a permit. I mean, that's sort of an empty category of people. There probably aren't any people in that category. Which doesn't, however, in my view, lead to the conclusion you shouldn't have a requirement for a permit and shouldn't be concerned about who gets it. But the criterion for getting it or not getting it should be your behavior. If you've done a crime and a court of law has shown that you've committed a crime, in other words, you have a criminal conviction, that's what should disqualify you, not just age. You know, that's a behaviorally based restriction, and it has a rational foundation. You know, obviously people who have in fact been criminal in the past are more likely, lots more likely to be criminal in the future. So there's a practical reason for restricting carry permits to those who have a clean record. It's not perfect, because some people, they do crime and they don't get convicted for it or even arrested. That's true. It's a limitation. But I don't think you ought to take people's legal rights away based on suspicion or accusations. You ought to have a legal procedure for establishing their guilt, and then that's what we take into account. So in other words, you keep them away from the bad guys, but you let the good guys have them if they want them. It's not a complicated principle. And the reason you let the good guys have them is because it has good effects. Defensive gun use is effective, and you can't use a gun defensively if you don't have it in the situation where the crime arises. And most crime occurs away from people's homes, which means they had to carry a gun to that location in order to have it available for defensive gun use. So it's not complicated, really. Once you kind of put all these little facts together, that's the implication. So in short, I'm in favor of laws that require you to have a permit and forbid permits to people who have a criminal record. And I'm even in favor of increased police enforcement of carry laws. They ought to be making more of an effort to find out who's illegally carrying and then arrest them and provide the evidence for them being convicted, because I want to discourage the carrying of guns by criminals. But I want to do it in a way that doesn't have the cost of taking them away from non-criminals.